Jonathan, welcome to Bentleys, and thank you again for spending some time with us. For those
Thanks,
that don't
Andrew.
know, I might get you to introduce yourself and give us a bit of a background on what you've done in the past and also an update on what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. So I'm Chief Economist at Challenger and Fidante. I've been here for about a bit over a year. And prior to that, I was at the Reserve Bank for way too many years. I'm giving it all away when I say it was probably about 28 years all up.
Yeah,
And
wow.
so
Okay.
in a combination of economics roles, financial markets roles, I had a couple of breaks away off to do my PhD and on a secondment working in Switzerland. So, and right now in Challenger, it's looking at the economic situation, contributing both to the views for clients and internally.
Excellent. Excellent. So you are perfectly placed for the questions I have for you today then.
I hope so.
We'll get straight into it. I guess the question at the moment on everyone's mouth is, where are rates going and what does it mean for me in my day-to-day life with inflation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go back to the start of the year, everyone was very confident that rates were going to be reduced this year. And, the markets were pricing in 3 cuts over the course of this year. But as the economic data have showed that inflation's a lot more persistent, the economy's not slowing as quickly, markets have been pulling right back on their expectations for rate cuts. I had been thinking at the beginning of the year that it was actually probably unlikely that we would have any cuts this year, simply because inflation is really quite sticky and persistent. And Australia didn't get rates as high as in other countries. So the amount of disinflationary impetus from monetary policy isn't as great here. So, I think there's a small chance of a cut this year, but more likely next year.
Sure. And I guess that sort of leads me to another question of how much influence are we under from what America are doing and around the globe from that interest rate pressure, and how far we are under our relative peers around the world?
Yeah. So most of what's going to determine the path for monetary policy in Australia is going to be domestic economic, data and information. But certainly we do in Australia still take a lesson from what's happening abroad to sort of see, it's giving us a bit of a guide of, well, inflation's been really persistent overseas. Why do we think Australia would be different? And often you do find that there are useful lessons coming from abroad. The other thing, there's a very small part of what the setting of monetary policy offshore means for financial conditions in Australia. And that's because there's a flow through to the exchange rate. So the higher interest rates are offshore, then that's going to contribute to a depreciation of the Australian dollar. So, if foreign central banks start cutting, but we don't cut, then that actually leads to an appreciation for the Australian dollar. So that tightens conditions a bit and means that it's a bit easier to start cutting rates.
Sure. And do you have sort of, I know you said you were thinking maybe the end of this year. Are you starting to push out towards sort of middle of 2025? Is that what you're thinking, or further? Do you think there's another rate increase to come now for Michelle Bullock and the team?
So I think it's unlikely that they will increase rates further. I think the Reserve Bank has been, very cautious in not wanting to see the labour market deteriorate too much. If anything, the labour market's probably actually been more resilient than they had been expecting. And so, they've had good news on that front, which probably actually would have given them the latitude to increase rates further. But I think having paused for as long as they have, they'd probably prefer not to start having to increase rates further again. So, but if we do see some, inflation surprising on the upside when we get the June quarter results, then I think there is some chance that they do increase, but I think it's unlikely at this stage. So my expectation is that we won't see any rate cuts this year, and it'll be well into next year. So, towards the end of the first quarter or into the third quarter.
Sure. Okay. And then I guess that kind of leads on to the next question I had for you was, what are your thoughts on immigration at the moment? I know it's a hot topic, and unemployment. at the moment. Where do you see the right balance is, do you think? Or are we there?
Yeah. Well, often people get worried about migration because of the effect, that it's contributing more people. And so there's a perception that that can, take jobs away from people who are already in Australia. But migrants actually add a lot to demand. And so, empirically there's very little relationship between the unemployment rate and migration.
Right.
Um, but at the moment, that's not really the concern. The concern about migration is really for the effect that it's having on the housing market.
Sure.
And that reflects that we just haven't been building enough housing. And so there's a view that, well, if we cut the migrants, then there's going to be more housing for people who are already in Australia. The difficulty is that the developers of housing are planning based on what they think the population is going to be in 2-3 years' time when they finish
Sure.
their apartments, when they finish those houses. And so they're always planning based on what migration flows, including student flows, are. So if we start playing around with migration too much, we're likely to reduce some of that new construction. And you certainly increase the uncertainty for developers. And so they'll be, less confident in building. So I think there are some significant risks there. The other thing is that the part of migration that is likely to be cut will be students. And students have been a very important export industry for Australian education sector. So, there's a risk there to the economic activity.
Sure. And I guess on that housing question, then, I know we saw new housing approvals drop. I think it was earlier this week. Do you think that is definitely going to be a change over time? We're going to see more approvals come back. We'll see more money invested back into housing. I know the government at the moment seems like they're all looking for a quick fix, and I think we all know that that's probably not something that is ever going to be a quick fix, and there's no easy or right answer.
Yeah, I think housing is just going to be the economic problem of our generation and the next generation. It's a really tricky one because it's become so much more expensive, and that's because we all like housing. And, we all want to live in a good location and everything.
Yeah, everyone wants to live close together, right? No one's moving out.
Exactly, and everyone wants a big house and lots of space and everything. And the reality is that that's just making it going to be more difficult for our children's generation and further people to purchase into the housing, and they're going to find it much harder to get the quality of housing that we currently have. So it is a huge challenge. The problem is we're just not building enough. We need to change the sort of structure of our cities. We need to accept that we're going to have higher density of housing. And things will evolve, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Sure. And then I guess that leads me on to the question around, we've had the budget this month, the federal budget. You see a lot of commentators say different things about, Michelle Bullock's coughing up her Wheaties when she finds out what came out and things like that. From your perspective and your background, I guess the budget is the budget, right? Like there's nothing that you can really change around it. That'll come and go, and the financial policy that the RBA instructs it's I'm guessing a longer term view almost.
Yeah, well, so you're right. The RBA does have to take into account what the budget means for economic activity. Yeah, but it takes the budget as given. The RBA can't influence that. It was no surprise, I guess, in the budget that we're probably headed to an election next year. With all likelihood, this will be the last budget before the election, and so it's an election budget. The government wanted to do something to sort of favourable for households. People are very sensitive to inflation at the moment, so the main measure in there was the energy rebate. And that's going to reduce measured inflation by about 0.5 percentage point by the middle of next year. And so the government's hope is obviously that by reducing inflation as far as it's being measured, that will leave room for the RBA to cut rates. The difficulty is that when you put in place the rebate, you reduce inflation by 0.5 percentage point. But 12 months later, when the rebate comes off, you get that inflation bounce back. And so what you're really doing is just shifting inflation from one point to another point. You're not
It's
really changing the underlying pressures.
kicking it down the road rather than dealing with the issue at hand, and I guess hoping that at that point in time we're in a bit better position.
Exactly. And, and certainly that would be, further down the track, bit after an election,
Yeah.
and, conditions
Can
might be
point the
different by
finger.
then.
Yeah. And then I guess the final question I have for you is, um, everyone has different views on the street, and people feel different in their pocket as to what's going on. I mean, from looking at it from outside of Australia, unemployment's at a good rate, interest rates are a reasonable level compared to historically. Do you think the economy is in a good position, and are we going along okay? Are we managing it well?
I think the economy is actually in a pretty good position. I mean, obviously, people have been facing higher prices and higher interest rates, and that makes things feel difficult. But if we look at the aggregate economy, the unemployment rate is at low rates that, I mean, until 6 months ago, that was the lowest rate that we'd had in 50 years.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. And so it
Yeah.
means that the benefits of the economy are being spread pretty widely, and that's a really good thing. Yeah, we're starting to see some stronger wage growth and a bit of catch up, which will compensate a bit for the higher inflation. So, overall, we're actually in a pretty good position, I would say.
Brilliant. Jonathan, appreciate your time once again. You're always so insightful. It's really great to hear from you. So thank you again for spending some time with us today.
Right. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Pleasure.